All right, great. All right, so we'll get started officially now, and I'll reintroduce myself. So my name's Alex Schoenfeld. I'm here today with my colleague, Amy Riley. Well, we're both with Pearson, and tell you a little bit about ourselves. So basically the format here is that I'm going to be moderating our conversation, managing the Q&A, but Amy's really the star of the show. She's going to be presenting and talking us through the slides. So there's that. So again, my name is Alex Schoenfeld. I'm a district assessment sales director. I handle the East region for the school assessment part of Pearson. And my colleague, Amy Riley, is a director of innovative solutions there. Here's just a little bit about the Assessment for Learning community. It's free, edweb.net/assessment. There's a whole bunch of benefits that you get from joining. You can view EdWeb webinars, including this one. You can earn your CE certificates. You download the slides and chat logs. I know a lot of people like to know where they can find the slides. That's where you can get them. You can also join online discussions and get the free resources. And there on the right, there's that cool little icon with the folks with the green hair. I'm told they're teachers. When you go onto the EdWeb website, that's the icon you're going to look for. And that's where you can get the recordings and slides and chat logs, because we know that people like to see those. So as I said, Amy and I are from Pearson. We're really proud and excited to be joining you today to talk about interim assessments. And quick introduction. So my name is Alex Schoenfeld, as I mentioned, District Sales Assessment Director for the East Region of NCS Pearson's School Assessment Group. I partner with school districts up and down the East Coast to help understand their assessment needs and organize solutions for them that will really help them advance and meet their needs. And Amy, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and then once we get off of the presentation, I'm going to turn off my audio and video and let you get at it.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you all of you who've joined us today. This is Alex and mine, our very first EdWeb webinar that we've done. So we're going to apologize in advance if I go too fast through the slides or click on the wrong button. We've practiced, and so hopefully we'll be able to pull it off. I'm Amy Riley. I'm based in Austin, Texas, and as of Monday, I just celebrated my 15th year at Pearson. I've held a lot of different positions. I've written content for different types of assessments. I've managed statewide assessment programs. And then over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been highly engaged in research and development projects. I have a real passion for understanding how we can make improvements about what students know and can do and how we measure that. I don't have a PhD. I used to be a teacher, a special ed teacher, and I have kids of my own. And so just throughout my 20-plus career, I've been really interested in this particular area and how I can be a part of hopefully improving some of these different assessment systems. I am here today to talk to you about 5 considerations for interim assessments. So interim assessments are starting to get a lot more buzz. Of course, many people know them as a critical part of a balanced assessment system. But what we're seeing at Pearson is there's just increased discussion around the uses for those. And so what I wanted to do during today's presentation is start first by just talking a little bit about what the field says around interim assessments. We've conducted a market research study about a year ago where we talked to teachers and principals. So I'm going to share a little bit about what current perceptions are. What exactly is an interim assessment? We commonly hear different people using different terms to mean the same thing. And then we also see a real variety of uses for interim assessments. Some of them may be appropriate for the design. Some of them, may be things that we need to think about. So all of that will lead into then, as you're thinking about interim assessment for your country, your school, your district, your state, what are some key things that you can think about that will help provide a framework for making some good decisions, ultimately that will help benefit your teachers and learners? Now, as I get started, I do want to recognize that my primary experience has been in the United States, and I notice that we have several people from other countries. So I want to apologize in advance if some of the terms that I use or the experiences aren't quite as applicable. I'd really be interested, for those of you that are from different countries, if there are things that don't quite connect or aren't part of your particular experience, just chat something in the box. I can connect with you after the webinar. And I'd really like to be able to understand a little bit about what experiences of interim assessments are in other countries and how that differs from what we've experienced in the United States. What we know in the United States, based on that research study that I just mentioned, is that overwhelmingly teachers and principals feel like there's too much testing in our schools. The particular statistic for teachers, I believe, is 89% of teachers feel like there's too much testing and 87% of principals. And so as we start this discussion, I think it's important to have that perspective in mind, because what we need to be able to do is demonstrate with the assessments through thoughtful design and reporting mechanisms, how can we improve the value that we get from these assessments so that they're truly worth the time that they're taking away from daily instruction with students. Relative to interim assessments, there's a few key worries that teachers and principals have. First of all, they get concerned that they're going to be judged based on student results, especially if those students have a bad day. We've seen in some districts that we've worked with that interim assessment results contribute to teacher evaluation measures, even their merit pay decisions. And so there's some pretty high stakes associated with these interim assessments, even though they're not considered summative state assessments used for accountability here in the U.S. Also, these assessments tend to take away time from teaching. That was a big concern. They drain resources. They tend to increase student stress. I was a district testing coordinator at one time, and I know we would basically walk down the building in the same way we would for a state summative test each time we administered one of these interim assessments, because we thought at the time we were helping to prepare students to get used to that level of anxiety. In hindsight, and that was a really long time ago, I'm not really sure that that level of effort was really worth the benefit that we got out of those particular assessments. And lastly, and I think this is a really insightful comment that we heard from our teachers, they tend to feel that there's a misalignment between what's being measured in an assessment, an interim assessment, particularly ones that are commercially available, with scope and sequence. So what they find is that the information provided is not always super useful because it's not related to the particular content standards that they just got finished teaching as part of an instructional unit. So I thought those were some pretty interesting comments that we heard from the field. Another thing that we learned in some of our research is that lots of people use different words to all mean something similar as an interim assessment, but there could be some nuances. So you'll see here in our word wall, there's periodic assessments, through course assessments, chapter tests, unit tests. Different projects might contribute to an interim assessment score. So a lot of the confusion is just related in that we don't necessarily all share a common vocabulary for an interim assessment. So one of the things I wanted to do is just provide you with my perception of how interim assessment is viewed in the field, and then provide you with a definition based on some of the literature. So when I think of interim assessment, for whatever reason, I think of that middle child. So we're all pretty familiar, or hopefully many of you are, with a balanced assessment system where we got formative assessment on one side, you got interim in the middle, and you've got summative in the end. What you see here is a picture of my three kids, Lily, Claire, and Jack. And Lily and Jack have very well-defined attributes. They're just kids that you know and understand. Claire is a fantastic kid, but she's a little bit harder to define. Being that middle child, I think that we find that sometimes they're just a little bit harder to label. Whereas if I look at Jack, he really wants to please, and Lily's all about having a good time. I think of that similarly in the sense of a balanced assessment system, when we're looking at these different characteristics of formative versus interim and summative. Now, just because I have a bigger space for interim, that's not intended to suggest that interims are more value. This isn't a value statement. What I'm suggesting here instead is that the uses and purposes, and sometimes the results that we get from interim, they share attributes of summative assessments as well as formative assessments. Sometimes we find that people use interim assessment results for pretty high stakes decisions, like what you might see through scores that contribute towards accountability measures. Likewise, even those same assessments, we tend to see teachers sometimes being dissatisfied with them because the grain size of information is not such that it can help necessarily with daily instruction. So I feel sometimes like interim assessments are just a little bit harder to label, where formative is very much an ongoing process where teachers are observing and modifying, and it's just very much rooted in the teaching and learning process. And summative is fairly well defined in that we understand its limitations and we understand its uses in our accountability system. Interim just feels like it is a little bit more difficult to label. But if I were to take a look at some of what the literature says, and this is from an article that Joan Herman wrote, this helps me give some guidance or understand some different things about interim assessments that I hope will help frame our discussion. Typically, they are mandated by a school or district. It's not usually something that a teacher necessarily would give as part of classroom assessment. What we see in the United States is that oftentimes they're not mandated at the state level. They're administered periodically, and this is a really important point. What we find is that interim assessments are usually administered either quarterly, maybe 3 times a year. It could be even as few as 2 times a year. So already right off the bat, because of how infrequent these assessments are administered, that's going to limit the instructional use we can apply in the classroom in terms of making very regular formative type instructional decisions. They give us information about how students are performing relative to short and longer term learning goals. And oftentimes they're used to help predict, even if it's just a gauge of how students are tracking relative to being ready for college and career or proficient on that end of year state test of what we have in the United States. They can provide information to teachers about individuals, their students, and in their individual students in their classrooms. You can use at a district level to compare across schools, across grades, and it really helps for school and district leaders to be able to examine those relative performances of each of those different groups. So what I've found in talking to different district leaders is that the interim assessments tend to have 3 different personas. And I wanted to mention this to you before I dive into the 5 different considerations, because I think it kind of helps to understand how they're often designed as you think through some of the different things I'm going to mention to you. I find that districts tend to either they usually write their own items and design their assessments, or they use a commercial bank and design their own assessments. But in both of those cases, they're designing their own assessments most typically to match their own unique scope and sequence. Conversely, districts may purchase a commercial assessment, and typically commercial assessments use what we call a common assessment design. And what that would mean is that each one of the assessments is going to cover the depth and breadth of the full year's curriculum. And they're going to look the same in terms of a blueprint, whether I administer it at the fall, winter, or spring. There's not going to be any adjustments in those common designs relative to scope and sequence. So if you think about it, you've got districts who either write their own items or use a bank and still create their own assessments, typically aligned to scope and sequence, or there's some sort of a commercial product that follows a common design. I'm sure that there are many variations to this. I certainly haven't talked to all the different districts, but this is what I found in most of the districts that I've worked with. So now as we start to dive into these 5 different considerations, one of the most important ones I feel like to start with, and I'd certainly be open to the questions that you all have and your feedback through the chat, is just like anything else you're going to hire or someone to do for you or that you're going to pay to do, think about what is the job that you're hiring this assessment to do. In other words, if I'm going to spend my resources or my money on a particular interim assessment, what is the outcome that I'm hoping to get from it? What is the change I want to be able to make? And in our research, we found that teachers and principals have a number of different purposes. So this is taken from a poll, and I apologize, this is probably really hard to see. But there's a range of different purposes or jobs that people hire interim assessments to do. And probably they're not just single jobs. More than likely, and you can kind of tell that just by the percentages, there's multiple jobs that they're hiring them to do. But I wanted to point out 2 in particular to you. The one that has the little dotted box around it towards the left, is to diagnose strengths and weaknesses. And I mention this because if you're thinking about diagnosing at what I would refer to as a domain level, so if I have math, within math I have geometry and measurement and data, those are domains, that may very well be appropriate for an interim assessment design. If I'm going to want to diagnose a student's strengths and weaknesses relative to being able to conceptually understand perimeter and area, as well as understand if they can apply those formulas, that's likely going to require a different assessment design, meaning you're probably going to need a lot more items to get to that granular information. And typically we see that interim assessment results or interim assessments are, a class period, maybe a couple of hours at most. We don't want to take too much time away from information. So I mention that to say that when we want to use interim assessments to perform a certain job, we need to be careful and make sure that that job is really going to be appropriate to what an interim assessment is intended to do. It might be in this particular case, depending on how you define diagnosing strengths and weaknesses, the diagnostic assessment or a formative assessment or any other numbers of types of assessments may be appropriate for that particular use. Now, on the other hand, if you look to the right, we see that information from interim assessments are also being used in evaluating teachers. So if I'm thinking about having an interim assessment where I might want fine-grained information to help me target specific strengths and weaknesses of students, but it also be able to give me information about teacher evaluation, something that has quite a bit of stakes associated with it, it's going to be hard to come up with a test that's going to be able to perform both of those jobs. So that's why I want to mention that it really requires, I think, some careful thinking as you consider what it is that you want to be able to use these assessments for, which leads me into my second consideration. And this one is, what are the types of decisions that you're going to make based on the results of the interim assessment? And think of that by your stakeholders. So the first step would be just identifying the particular stakeholders that these assessment results would elicit some sort of change for. So here I've got students, teachers, and then school and district level leaders. So at the student level, I can use interim assessment results to focus on remediation, providing enrichment opportunities, sorry, just had a pop-up, parent involvement, in the sense that I could engage parents to talk about their results, of course, probably looking at other pieces of information as well. I might suggest that there needs to be some sort of a program type change for a student or a group of students. It may also give me some information that allows me to have a discussion with a student in terms of setting goals for them. Now, if I'm a teacher, there's a different set of decisions that could be made. I could look at different professional development opportunities and make some decisions about that. Maybe it helps me determine discussions that need to be held as part of a professional learning community. It could also help me identify maybe where I could partner teachers together or create mentoring relationships. The types of results that come from interim assessments would support all of those types of decisions. And then when we look at the school or district level, one of the things I'm really interested in that model where you're aligned to scope and sequence is how could results from these interim assessments give you some evidence to support making changes in how you pace curriculum. So, of course, there's lots of different curricular programs, and we're seeing more and more that people are combining different ones as part of free resources that are available to them. But this would serve as just some sort of argument for making some changes or validating the particular scope and sequence you already have in place at your school or district. From a higher level perspective, it might help determine professional development for school or even for the district. And then when you're thinking through programs that you might want to purchase or be able to implement, such as different types of interventions, interim assessment results can contribute to that. What I think about in terms of these decisions is really the stakes associated with them. And so I would ask myself, what is the risk to these different stakeholders if I make a bad decision? And do I have enough information? Do these assessments have enough psychometric rigor to support my ability to make that type of a high stakes decision? And I think that's really important. I've seen several examples where oftentimes districts are using information from these assessments to make pretty big, important decisions. But when you uncover some of it a little bit, you can see that the items don't necessarily have statistics. You can't really identify if they're easier or harder. You don't know if the test design really is such that means that you could make reliable inferences based on this information. So that's why I think decisions, along with the job that assessments can do, are just really critical for districts and others to think through as they're considering different types of interim assessment programs. My next consideration for interim assessments is really taking a hard and honest look at the constraints that you have. And these constraints, of course, can vary whether you're at the state level, whether you're at the school level or district level. But when you think through constraints, I just think it helps you identify, what are non-starters in terms of your assessment design, what you can afford to be able to purchase. The first one that I have there is thinking through balancing over-testing concerns. So I have to consider carefully the length of the assessment, the frequency of the assessment with the usefulness of that assessment. I think what has happened to us, at least in the United States, and I can speak in particular from some experience that I've had with my own children, is that there's a lot of time spent testing, and that doesn't necessarily balance out to the value that I get from that assessment as a parent. It could be that it's much more helpful for the teacher, and I'm sure it is. I would hope that it is. But we need to just be careful that all of these different constraints relative to how long these assessments take, the stress that they cause on students, et cetera, are really worth it. President Obama enacted the Testing Action Plan, I believe it was in 2015. And in it, he really challenged educators to look at fewer assessments. And then there was a comment about assessments being worthwhile, assessments worth taking. And I think that's a very key consideration, so that when you're talking to your stakeholders, you can really get behind this particular assessment and why it is an assessment worth taking, worth the time spent from instruction. Other constraints are probably a little bit easier to think through. Do you have computers if you're going to have an online assessment system? Do you need to reserve lab space? What is going to be the cost of this? What are your staffing needs, including professional development, but also just for administration? Are you going to have small group administration and individual administration? That all takes time and logistical planning that can be a burden and certainly something to consider. In addition, districts may want to think about the security protocols that they want to have in place and the value of interruptions to normal school activities. So do you want an assessment that, for math, for example, that can be taken during a math class period and give you the type of information that an assessment of that length would be able to generate? Or are you okay with it taking several hours, but interrupting other class periods, recess, et cetera? And so those are decisions that districts need to weigh. Districts and schools, of course, have their own mandates that they have to follow through, different rules that their school boards have in place. And now in the United States, with the passing of the Every Student Succeeds Act, we have states needing to set short and long-term goals relative to proficiency and growth. Districts will need a way to measure whether or not they are on track to those. If you can't administer a summative assessment more than one time a year, that's going to really limit your ability to make any change. So that's a good reason to think about an interim assessment as an alternative to knowing that you're on track. And one reason why districts and schools may determine that these have to be administered. And then finally, I think it's important to think about, in terms of constraints, the messaging that you want to send to your parents and community. Are you prepared to stand by these particular assessments and the decisions of why they are important? Because we all know that likely that parents are going to ask some questions and they're going to want to know. The fourth consideration for interim assessment is, what do you value? So not quite the opposite of what are your constraints, But I find in talking to different school districts that they all want everything. And we all do whenever we're looking at trying to purchase something. But we think about the different areas that we might value. It may be worth prioritizing some because it's going to be hard to find a solution that can maybe meet all of these. But when I talk to school districts, I often hear that the most important thing is that it's a very clear alignment to their state or other national standards. It's really important that they can see in the instantiation of that particular item how that measures a particular construct. They need that tight alignment in order to have assurance that they are measuring students against what they're supposed to be. It's also really important that we think about depth of knowledge. Are we sticking with items that are relatively lower complexity or ones that really require higher level thinking skills? And so thinking about the depth of knowledge and how that relates to the assessment system that you purchase or the items that you write, I think is really important. A lot of districts are also concerned with the similarity of their interim assessments relative to that end-of-year test. We hear that they want the items to look like PART, for example, or SMART or Balance, or the STAR test here in Texas. And I think that's all very valid because they want to be able to have some assurances that the assessments that they're giving are representative of what students are going to see, and maybe even that students have some exposure to those item types before they get in a high-stakes situation. That may not necessarily be the only reason to have items that are representative of what's on a summative assessment, but for some district, it certainly appears to be of concern and something that's very important to them. Teacher scoring, I think, is another big one. So most recently, it's feeling like we're starting to see a bit of a shift in some states of going from really complex items to ones that are a bit more efficient. And it was the opposite about 5 years ago, where we went from items that were highly efficient to ones that were really rigorous and complicated for students to get through. They had a lot more interactions, particularly if they were online. As it relates to open-ended items, that gives you an opportunity, of course, to dive deeper into what the student knows about a particular piece of content, but it also gives the teacher the benefit for direct observation. So instead of having to look at a score, to be able to actually see a work product and make his or her own determination about student performance is very valuable to a lot of districts. Other districts may feel like that's a constraint in the sense that it could be a burden. It also requires professional development, of course, so that you make certain that your scoring is highly reliable across all your teachers. Otherwise, the inferences that you start to make across your different comparison groups may not be as reliable as you may think. Some districts highly value alignment to scope and sequence. What we will hear is that sometimes teachers don't pay as much attention to the data if they can't see that direct connection to what's been taught. And so by going in and defining their own local scope and sequence, or using some sort of model framework provided by the state that they decide to implement or somehow tweak, but aligning their assessments to their particular scope and sequence by creating clusters of content around an instructional unit is very important. And then other types of things that districts tend to value are the information that they get out of it, what they're obviously able to provide back to their teachers, back to their instructional coaches, but also information that can be provided at parent conferences, maybe used as grades, etc. So now to the fifth one. Based on the answers to all of those questions, and those things are not really questions that you can just answer, in a 5-minute meeting. And they're really ones that require a lot of deep thinking about what's important to you, what are the constraints within your decision, your district, what are the types of decisions and the stakes associated with those decisions that you want to be able to make, and then ultimately, what do you want this assessment to change for your students? Those are all really important ones that take time and thought to be able to think through. But based on those, then it can help you sort of back into a design and the level of feedback, the performance data that you get from students that helps you understand if these assessments are actually supporting the job that you hired them to do. And one important comment that I have here in bold and slightly bigger letters at the bottom is that the assessment design, what you're going to measure when, the depth and breadth that you're going to measure different standards, as well as the underlying measurement model, how they're going to be scored, if you're going to use scale scores, if performance levels, all those types of things. It's really important that those match the intended use of results. So I mentioned earlier a scenario where districts sometimes use district-created assessments for high-stakes decisions. And that may be a very appropriate use of those types of assessments. But I'd also argue that if those assessments don't necessarily have evidence behind them to support those high-stakes decisions, you could be at risk of making a bad decision that has a really big impact. And what I mean by that more specifically is that items where you don't know very much about their technical quality. Are they easy? Are they hard? Are they tricky? Are they biased? Assessment designs where it's unclear on if you have enough items for a particular reporting category to really support a reliable inference. Those questions really need to be asked and made sure that they match up with the particular use of the assessment. So earlier in the presentation, I mentioned to you that there are 3 different personas that districts tend to adopt when it comes to interim assessment designs. And now that we've talked through some of these different considerations, I just wanted to provide my own thoughts on some of the pros and cons relative to those, just for you to think about. So the first one was where districts write their own test items and they design their own assessments. So the pros of that model is that you get a lot of teacher involvement typically. It's usually a scenario where there might be teacher workshops or teacher review meetings where they go in and they really analyze the items and they think about their students and how their students would respond to them. And think very hard about the standards and what those grade level expectations are. It allows for the district to give their own interpretation of the standard. So when they look at that item and they look against that standard, however they've decided to interpret that along with supporting evidence that the state provides or other documentation, it allows them to be able to marry those 2 things up in the way that they want. It allows for alignment to their particular scope and sequence for what we refer to as instructional validity. So that means really assessing what's been instructed. The con of that is that it requires a lot of expertise to write good items. I've been in assessment now, as I mentioned, for about 20 years, and a lot of that time was spent writing items, and it took practice and it took learning. And that's hard sometimes to do in a workshop over the summer for a day or 2. It's putting a lot on some of our resources where that's not necessarily their day job. Their day job is teaching. And so that's just something to consider. And of course, not all districts are created equal. Some districts have a lot of resources with this type of expertise. Others don't have as much. And so those are the types of constraints or things that you would consider when you look at this particular type of model. And then, of course, the other component of that is it's not just about the items, it's about the tests themselves. I mentioned something a moment ago about reliability of results. And so when we're thinking about the different constraints we have relative to the amount of time spent testing, and we think about the reliability of the results, that tends to mean we need to somehow balance the number of items for a particular standard or a particular domain or even a particular content area, how many of those we have relative to the type of reporting we're going to do. So I've seen examples where in some cases a district might overload and sample way more from a particular standard and very little from another standard. And yet when they look at that standards information and make some judgment about standards mastery, sometimes that's not always taken into account, the fact that we maybe spent more time testing on a particular standard by giving students too many items, and yet we're making a very important inference about another standard that only has 1 item, where that might not be enough for us to really have confidence in the reliability of that result. There's also the scenario where sometimes we make growth interpretations about how students have performed from, say, a pre-test to a post-test. And that's another area just to be cautious of, because if I don't know the difficulty level of one assessment to the next, it's possible I think that my students are actually performing better when actually on that post-test, it happened to be a selection of easier items. So these are just things to be cognizant of when you're thinking about interim assessments and their designs and the particular model that you want to approach, is really paying attention to sort of that underlying measurement model and truly what it is able to support. We also see districts using commercial item banks in designing their own assessments. And this is a particularly attractive option for a district that maybe doesn't have the resources or staff available to write their own items. Oftentimes, of course, that requires an authoring system of where you're actually going to input those items. And so if you have some sort of an assessment platform and you can import a commercial bank, and many of them have a lot of items, and that seems very attractive because it gives you many options, then they take those items and then they continue to design their own assessments, again, typically around scope and sequence. The benefit of this model is, again, you have that improved instructional validity. You're measuring what has been instructed. The con, however, is that it still requires that test design expertise. So make sure you're not introducing any unintended consequences relative to the interpretation of those results. So just like in the previous model, being cautious with making interpretations around growth and be cautious in terms of making interpretations around standards or reporting categories for which we may have low reliability. Another con to this model is that many of these banks have been used in lots of different states, and they have claims about standards alignment. And I'm sure that most of those claims are good ones and valid ones. But I think it's also worth questioning whenever you're considering using a commercial bank for some sort of an interim assessment or even a formative assessment, that what is the evidence of that bank alignment? What was the protocol used to evaluate the items? How did you determine if an item was highly aligned versus partially aligned? So really thinking through that standards alignment piece. And just because these banks tend to be fairly large and they're not homegrown by virtue of a district creating these assessments or these items, their sheer volume means that it can take quite a bit of time and resources for people to actually go through and look at all these items and evaluate for themselves if they're really good ones. Do they meet the rigor? Getting back to those values, is it a range of depth of knowledge? Does it have teacher scoring like what we're looking for? So sometimes that can also just take quite a bit of time, even though your effort isn't been spent on writing the items themselves. For the last model, I mentioned that these are oftentimes commercial products where they leverage what we refer to as a common design. So going back to how I described that earlier, that's when you have an assessment design that typically covers the depth and breadth of the entire curriculum. It's usually weighted. So there are certain things that I might focus on more just because they're more important. They're maybe my power standards, et cetera. But usually the commercial product, that vendor is the one who makes those types of decisions based on their expertise. But that same assessment design is delivered multiple times a year. And then you're able to make some degree of comparisons from fall to winter, winter to spring, fall to spring, even fall for 1 year to fall the following year. The pro of this kind of model is that oftentimes the product owners of these typically vendors, they employ the resources that allow for high technical rigor. You can have confidence in psychometric quality. There should be some technical resources that allow you to be able to evaluate how well the items have performed, the different types of scoring models that they use, how predictive they are to summative assessments through different types of linking studies. However, the con is that we would argue that there tends to be low instructional validity, particularly for those earlier assessments. So fall and winter, for example, if I administer an assessment in the fall that covers the entire year's worth of instruction, and my students have only been exposed to a third of that instruction, is that really a good use of the student's time to be exposed to items for which the content underlying them, they have not yet been given the opportunity to learn? So that's just another consideration as you're thinking through these different designs and what you value in terms of being aligned to scope and sequence or being able to make some of these other types of interpretations, is really considering, that decision point of being aligned to scope and sequence versus leveraging this common blueprint idea. Another benefit of the common blueprint, however, that I want to make sure to emphasize, because they certainly do have lots of benefits as well, is that from a district resource perspective, they typically don't require as much. You're implementing an assessment system that is already built and ready for you to be able to use. And usually these commercial systems can provide you with the evidence needed to help support things like standards alignment or that predictiveness to that state summative assessment. If they don't provide that, I would certainly approach them with caution. So in closing, because I want to be sure and allow plenty of time for questions and questions that you all have, I've seen some pop up in the chat as I've been speaking. I just have a couple final thoughts that I want to be able to share relative to interim assessments. So in the beginning of my presentation, when I showed you that wide bar of interim assessments relative to formative and summative, in the sense that we have a lot of people expecting a lot from interim assessments, it's important to remember that no single assessment can be all things to all stakeholders. We're working really hard to get as much information out of these tests as we possibly can so that they are a really good use of people's time, getting back to that idea of balancing the burden with the value. But it's important to, of course, always remember that they can't serve both typically a real fine-grained formative type decision or diagnosis, as well as a big picture of how you're tracking to your small and long-term learning goals, or if you're on track to being college and career ready or proficient on that end-of-year assessment. It would be hard to be able to accomplish both of those things with a test that's going to be administered during the school day. What we find is that if you want to have as many items needed to be able to make all those fine-grained decisions, and you're only going to administer that test every 6 to 8 weeks, it would be a really, really long assessment for you to have the reliability in order to make be confident in your decisions. So just a reminder about the specific purpose of the interim assessment, and that really is to know if you're on track. The second pitfall that I might mention is limiting the stakes of the decisions to the quality of the assessment. So always asking yourself, does this assessment give me enough evidence of its quality to be able to risk making a bad decision? So would I be comfortable influencing a student's grade, especially like if they're in high school and it might impact their overall GPA based on how this test was designed, the quality of the items, the measurement model, how it's scored underneath it. So just thinking through what are the stakes associated with these particular decisions, how am I going to impact my students, my teachers, my school and district leaders, and making sure that the quality of assessment really supports those decisions. And then finally, scores provide some information, but in my opinion, they should never be viewed in isolation. So they're data points. And if I'm going to be making a decision about a particular student, an interim assessment score, maybe at the overall content area, at the domain level, that gives me some good information, but more likely than not, it's going to cause me to think, I need to dig in a little bit deeper and look at that student's formative assessment results. Look at that student's absenteeism or tardies or other behavior types of issues. Understanding a little bit more about the whole child and supporting the decisions that you're going to make, I think is really important. So we don't place quite so much pressure on making a big decision just based on a single score, a single day alone. So with that, Alex, I will turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. So we have a bunch of questions here for you, and I'm going to go through some of them. I'm probably not going to get to all of them, but we'll do my best. And the first question that I wanted to ask is, there was one question here. Can assessments be aligned to the content standards for specific states? This is coming from somebody in Ohio.
Can interim assessments be aligned to a state's content standards?
Yes.
Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue that they really should be. I would question if they weren't. It gets back to that idea of instructional validity. Ideally, you're measuring the standards that have been taught in the classroom. That's going to give you the best information. If you're not measuring what's been taught, it's hard to untangle if a student actually doesn't know something because they haven't been taught it, or because you're measuring it in a way that's unfamiliar because it's based on a particular aspect of the standard, that is new to them. And so I think that whole notion of standards alignment, in particular for interim assessments, is really important and a good question for districts to ask whenever they're thinking about either purchasing a system or designing their own.
Great. Another question here, this one's from Texas. The participant asks, when creating an interim, how do you go about balancing a limited amount of time testing, like an hour or so, with an interim looking to test a large number of standards or substandards? That's the first part. And then there's a second part. What consideration would you take into account as a priority if all of the state standards are considered equally important to assess? And then yet a third part of the question. Is it possible for one or two items for each standard or substandard to provide enough information?
Okay, so I'm going to try and remember these. We'll see how well I do.
Right, I'll give you the first part.
Yeah.
When creating an interim, how do you go about balancing a limited amount of time testing with an interim looking to test a large number of standards or substandards?
Yeah, I think that that's a really great question, and I'm excited to actually get that one because I think it's very important. So it really all goes back to the level at which you're going to report. And if I'm thinking about my standards hierarchy where I have a content area, math, and then I have domains like numbers base 10 or fractions or geometry, and then underneath them I have standards, and underneath them I have substandards. I'd love for an assessment to be able to give me information about those substandards. But traditionally, in my experience, in the high stakes assessments, so again, these are not high stakes, so I'm sure that there's some leeway there. You can't make a good decision based on one item for each one of those different categories. So the option then is to report at a higher level, which would be that domain level or even the math content level. And then you sacrifice, I think, some of the usefulness of those results. So it really goes back to thinking through what your constraints are. So if you've only got an hour, and what is your goal? What is the job you want this assessment to do? Is it to track progress? Is it to predict summative? Is it for teachers to make fine-grained instructional decisions? Well, if it's for that latter one, then that may be more appropriate for a formative assessment that's shorter and more targeted on the particular standards and substandards that you want to be able to measure. And maybe that's something that you implement as more of a formative type assessment system. Interim assessments being administered every 8 weeks have to cover to some degree the depth and breadth of what's been taught as part of that unit of instruction. And the only way that you're going to be able to get enough reliability down to the standard and substandard level is going to sample so much from those particular standards and substandards to have reliable results that you're going to end up having a really long test. So I would suggest that for interim assessments, you think about it at a little bit higher level, because what you're really wanting to get at is that predictiveness and if students are on track relative to that instructional unit. And so you don't need to sample from every single standard or substandard, and think about how you can leverage other types of assessments as part of your system that can give you that more fine-grained information that's probably going to be useful for diagnosing strengths and weaknesses and for teachers to make more regular instructional decisions. Other instructional decisions can be made from information that you get at the domain level.
Cool. All right, I think you hit most of the points of that question, so I think I'm just going to move on to another one. One of the questions here is, do teachers, or should teachers, have input on what questions to include on interim assessments, or is that more of a supervisor's role for assessments?
I would go back to what your particular district values. I think that there can be some pitfalls of teachers having a lot of involvement at the item level, in the sense that we all tend to glean on what's concrete. And when you see a concrete representation of content via an item, it's just human nature then that's how you're going to gear your teaching, as opposed to the overall construct. And I don't think that anybody intends for that to happen. I think that's just a byproduct of it. And in fact, we've actually seen some districts where they've been quite explicit of it, where they actually give teachers those items in advance of an instructional unit so that they can use them to help guide their teaching. That's a particular value of that district. So the question of, a teacher versus a supervisor, that's really up to what the district values. I will say that traditionally in commercial products, items are kept secure, and we might give things like examples of items that can be used for that purpose.
Great. Another question that I have here is, I've got actually two questions. They're separate questions, but I'm going to ask them together. The questions are, where do quizzes fit into an assessment program? And then another question, actually it's more of a comment from a participant saying, we use formative exercise for interim assessments. So I'm going to actually interpret that to say performance-based assessment. So where do performance-based assessments and quizzes fit into an assessment program?
Right, that's a great question. So in the Joan Herman definition that I referenced, that's actually pulled from a paper that she wrote, and I don't know the mechanism for being able to share it with this group, but it's a really pivotal paper. I felt like, being a super assessment nerd, I got a lot from it. But one of the things that it talks about is this notion of a comprehensive assessment system. So whereas we think of formative, interim, and summative, she actually breaks it down a little bit further into classroom summative. And classroom summative are oftentimes those things like quizzes, end of chapter tests that are used for grades. So it's of learning, but it's for a smaller section of the curriculum. Whereas interim, a good way to think about that is it's something that might be administered 4 times a year or 3 times a year. But that goes into that whole notion of them being really hard to label, being that middle child of the balanced assessment system. Because they do have vastly different interpretations depending on who you talk to. But that's how I would think of quizzes, as more of a classroom summative, kind of sitting more in that classroom space as opposed to an interim per se. Now, if it's a quiz that you give every 8 weeks, and it covers all that's part of that instructional unit, then that might fall a little bit more into the interim space. Your second question with regards to performance assessment. In my opinion, there's no reason why performance assessment can't contribute as an interim assessment score. Again, if it's aligned to scope and sequence, or even, I suppose, if it were to follow that full blueprint or curriculum, that's asking a lot of a performance assessment. That would be a very, very large one. But again, if it's something that covers those particular standards that are associated with it, and you're able to track progress of students to short and long-term goals and make some sort of predictive judgment about how they are on track to overall proficiency, then I could definitely see that working. And what we see in a lot of states is their combination. So maybe you have some sort of a more traditional looking test with some multiple choice items, machine scored items, and it's accompanied by a portfolio or a performance task, or we consider open response items to also be performance-based.
Great. Thanks, Amy. So I think we have a couple more slides that I want to make sure we get through. And if we're done, we can handle a couple more questions, but I do want to make sure we get through our slides here. So I'm going to go ahead and advance. Okay. I just wanted to take a moment to mention Transcend. Transcend is a new product that Pearson's working on. It's an integrated assessment system. It includes both Transcend Math and Transcend Reading for grades 3 through 8. It's the first truly integrated assessment system. It's aligned to state standards as well as your district scope and sequence. We use a custom cumulative test design to assess what students have been taught against your district's curriculum map, and it provides overall content and domain scores as well as growth scores. It's got some state-of-the-art reporting features that we've designed with the expertise of some data visualization and data scientists. And we're actively recruiting early adopters and research partners. So if you're interested in participating in the creation of this product, we'd love to hear from you. My contact information there is on the screen. I'm your guy. It's alex.schoenfeld@pearson.com. And my phone number is there as well, 609-240-9346. If you didn't catch that, it's going to be in the slides, which will be available to you on EdWeb's website. And I certainly do hope I hear from you. I've seen some great engagement so far. And so thank you everybody for attending. I'll take a look and see if we have any more questions that we can get. Oh, we had a question about the Joan Herman paper, and somebody had actually asked, I think that was the name, somebody had asked, was asking for a sample of an assessment matrix for teachers. I think that may very well be in that
Yes.
paper.
Yeah, it's called a Comprehensive Standards-Based Assessment Systems Supporting Learning. And so I don't know if it's possible to plop that into the chat or not. Comprehensive Standards-Based Assessment Systems Supporting Learning, and it's by Joan Herman. And I don't necessarily know Joan Herman. Certainly she's not paying me to pitch her paper, but I found that it really did provide a lot of good information, just a great framework for thinking about how we define these different types of assessments and really going beyond just formative, interim, summative, by incorporating diagnostic, incorporating classroom summative with those quizzes and things like that.
Great. Thanks, Amy. And then there's one more part of a question here with our last moment. There was a question like, is it possible, so if you're building an interim assessment, is it possible for one or two items for each standard or substandard to provide enough information?
So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not a PhD, I'm not a psychometrician. My personal opinion is no. Unless that item is really complex and has multiple parts and you're getting lots of pieces of evidence from that particular item. So like if it's a performance task that has 4 different components to it or something like that, that would certainly be different. If we're talking about a single multiple choice item and making a decision about how students are performing, especially if it has any sort of stakes associated with it, and even stakes in terms of pulling students out for programs or for extra help or anything like that, I would be very cautious in making a decision, based on results that I get from a single item, especially if that particular item I don't know anything about. I don't know if it's easy or hard or tricky or biased. So I would use a lot of caution there.
Great. Thanks, Amy. And that's the top of the hour. So thank you, everybody, for participating. It's been a joy, and we hope you've found this to be informative.